A mais fina verdade é que nem sempre nós temos a oportunidade de dizer obrigado aos nossos heróis. Olhar no rosto deles e agradecer. Muitos de nós somos abençoados e escapamos de momentos terríveis na vida por meio de pessoas que não nos conhecem. É um sermão que você viu no YouTube, é um livro de um autor americano ou de alguém que até já morreu. E às vezes você é abençoado, transformado, inspirado, salvo por meio de gente que não te conhece. Talvez um dos momentos mais importantes da minha vida foi quando em uma conferência fiel, excelente conferência fiel, certamente uma das melhores conferências teológicas que nós temos no Brasil, eu fui lá e pude conhecer o Paul Washer, e com o meu inglês horroroso, na época, muito pior do que o de hoje, eu pude apertar a mão do Paul Washer e dizer tudo que eu consegui dizer na hora. Eu disse: God used you to save me from wrath. Deus usou você pra me livrar da ira. Era quase um mimetismo da palavra, do modo como o Paul Washer fala algumas coisas. Ele só disse Praise the Lord. E aí eu pude tirar foto com ele, conhecê-lo. Mas assim, não pude bater papo com o Paul Washer. Mas foi um momento importante pra mim poder dizer isso pra ele. Que Deus o usou pra me salvar da ira de Deus. E uma pessoa que Deus me deu, assim, um presente de poder conhecer, de poder bater um papo, almoçar e fazer uma entrevista foi o David Murray. Não sei se você sabe quem é o Murray, que hoje mora no Michigan, pastoreia a First Byron Christian Reformed Church. E o Murray escreveu 2 obras que tiveram responsabilidade em salvar a minha vida. Ele escreveu Reset e escreveu Refresh, junto com a esposa, publicados também pela editora Fiel, materiais que me ajudaram muito quando eu tava passando por um período de burnout em 2019, 2020, onde eu tava lutando profundamente com questões de saúde mental, questões de ideação suicida, ataques dos mais variados, e eu posso dizer com tranquilidade que os materiais do Murray foram em parte responsáveis por eu estar vivo hoje. Então, se você é abençoado pelo que eu produzo aqui no YouTube, parte da longevidade desse ministério é responsabilidade do pastor Murray. E eu não só tive a graça da parte de Deus de poder dizer isso pra ele, como pude fazer algumas perguntas pra ele sobre saúde mental, sobre burnout pastoral, sobre lidar com essas questões difíceis de ministério, baseado também nos livros dele. Se você quiser conhecer os materiais dele, Reset é mais voltado para homens, Refresh é mais voltado para as mulheres. Eu li os 2 e achei maravilhoso. Vou colocar o link aqui na descrição se você quiser ter acesso a esses livros, mas eu queria convidá-lo a assistir essa entrevista inteira. Sempre que eu posto materiais legendados, entrevistas em inglês no YouTube, aqui no 2 Dedos de Teologia, geralmente vocês não engajam tanto nesse tipo de conteúdo. Eu sei que é mais chato, muitos de vocês só ouvem, não ficam assistindo e vendo, tem que ler legenda, nem sempre é a coisa mais divertida do mundo, mas eu lhe convido a ouvir esse bate-papo com o Murray. Eu tenho certeza que vai ser especial e transformador para a sua vida. Também lhe convido a ler os materiais dele. Você está passando por burnout, por períodos de estresse no ministério, ou mesmo na vida comum, o testemunho do Murray é muito impactante. Foram livros que salvaram a minha vida. Tenho certeza que pode salvar a sua vida também. Agradeço muito ao pessoal da editora Fiel por ter feito esses livros existirem em português e fazer o Murray falar em português com a gente. E já peço para você que for assistir, já perdoar o meu inglês ruim, porque meu inglês é uma porcaria. Eu sempre digo isso, tá? Meu inglês é uma porcaria. Eu não tenho vergonha do meu inglês. Eu sei que ele não é bom, mas ele funciona. Todos os americanos que eu tô lá nos Estados Unidos, seu inglês é muito bom, seu inglês é muito bom, seu inglês é muito bom. Todo mundo é legal, eu só escuto gente reclamando do meu inglês que é brasileiro. Eu sempre faço esse disclaimer logo, pra dizer, meu inglês é ruim mesmo, sei que vou chegar meu inglês aí, deixa de ser chato. Tô tentando melhorar, toda vez eu tento melhorar meu inglês aí, um dia ele vai ficar bom, certo? Se nunca ficar bom, eu vou continuar trazendo entrevista com o americano com inglês ruim do mesmo jeito, tá? Então você pode passar por cima do meu inglês, mas ouça o inglês escocês, David Murray, que é um inglês muito legal de ouvir, escocês é muito bacana. Então esse é o vídeo de hoje, assista lá. Seja muito bem-vindo ao 2 Dedos de Teologia, e eu estou com a presença magnânima de David Murray.
Good to be here.
Yeah. You David understood, right?
No Portuguese here, but hi. I think that's pretty universal.
Yeah. Pastor David, a great pleasure, a honor to meet you, welcome you here on YouTube. It's
Great
amazing
to be with you.
Yeah, it's the first time on YouTube.
I think I've done a few before, but first time with a Brazilian.
Yeah. You already speak Portuguese through your books, right?
Well, I believe some of them have been translated.
Yeah.
And just recently I was sent a picture of a friend who was visiting Brazil, and he was in a pastor's study, and he'd pulled out 2 of my books that were translated into Portuguese. That was really heartening. It was encouraging.
You can talk with people from another country through books is really amazing thing.
It is amazing.
Yeah. I wrote 2 books.
Yeah.
You wrote The Reset and The Refresh.
Yes.
One of them with your wife. Mm-hmm. And man, I need to begin saying that. I need to give you a word of gratitude.
Oh,
you know?
Okay.
In 2019, I got off what after was diagnosed as a burnout.
Burnout, really?
You know?
Yeah.
In the beginning of my pastoral ministry. I was an assistant pastor, then I became a senior pastor.
Okay.
And in the beginning of my ministry as a senior pastor was not a smooth transition, you know?
Yeah.
It was really, really intense. And then I began to feel things I were not figure out what.
Yeah.
And then I was struggling with my health, my mental health, and thinking about bad things, suicide and something. And I went to therapy, I went to friends in ministry to talk about it. I was helped by my church, by my family.
Yep.
But your books was really important in this process
That's
of
great.
health.
That's
you
great.
know?
Yeah, go.
If I'm alive today,
yeah.
I need to take thanks to you.
Oh, thank you.
People who who like what we are doing on the internet need to take thanks to
I'll take
to
it.
Pastor David, because was one of things that God used to help me was your books, to figure out what's happening and make plans.
Right.
Make plans to
Right.
improve and make sure that will not happen again.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And that's one of the subjects of this interview. Where did the idea to write 2 books on the problem of ministerial overload, burnout, where did this come from? For something that happened to you, to your family, friends, church?
Yep. So I think about 2010, 2011, maybe a bit like you, I was teaching at Puritan Reformed Seminary. And as anyone knows who has done teaching in an academic setting, the first few years are incredibly stressful because you're making up your courses, you're trying to keep just a day ahead. Also, there were many opportunities to speak at weekends. So I was going away on a Friday, coming back on a Monday, and also trying to keep preaching as well, because I was a pastor at heart. And so at the same time, trying to raise 4 kids and adapt to life in a new country, and then visiting my home country of Scotland regularly to keep in touch with my family. Just way too much.
I'm tired, just listen.
And of course, you know, you think you're indestructible because you're doing the Lord's work.
Yeah.
You know, you think you'll get supernatural strength. And I mean, God does times and for a time do that for us when we need it, but not all the time, right? That mustn't become our default. So what happened with me, like with some people, mental health goes. Other people, it might be moral health that goes. They end up in pornography or something like that. For me, it was my physical health that broke down. And I had probably 2 or 3 surgeries in the previous year. I just, get through them, keep going. Then I was struggling to sleep. I had a car accident, probably due to mind elsewhere. I did a 360 on a highway near Lansing. Survived. So I felt all of these things were God waving a red flag. Like, hey, David, can I have your attention? And so I promised myself I could look at my calendar. I'd kept this summer free. If I could get to May, we're good. Then I'll, change everything. And well, just before that, I ended up with blood clots in my lungs. What do they call it? Pulmonary emboli.
Ooh.
And I'd just been sitting there one night to relax, actually. And just sitting in a chair like this, suddenly felt this pain go from my chest upwards, felt very hot. My wife's a doctor, and she said, straight to ER, David. And I said, no, I'm fine. Just give me some time, because I'm indestructible. Did you not know that? Yeah. So she finally forced me to get to the hospital. Cut long story short, ended up getting in CT scans, and the doctor said, you have blood clots all over your lungs. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound good. And I'd heard of people dying of this. Maybe 15% of people die with this. But if you get to hospital, you've got a good chance of surviving. So I was in hospital for a few days, blood thinning, ended up on blood thinners for 6 months. They didn't find anything genetically wrong with me, so they put it down to stress, which does tend to thicken the blood a bit. And of course, we believe God was in this. And I took it very seriously. I really believe God was saying, hey, David, slow down, stop, change your ways. And I did for a time, but it didn't last. I went back to my default workaholism probably within a couple of years, ended up in hospital again with blood clots in my lungs again. And this time I knew it was like 3 strikes and you're out, and I've already had 2. And so that was the turning point. My wife and I really began to put together a program of just looking all aspects of my health. Started writing about it on my blog, talking with others. Pastors started coming to me, similar like to yourself. And I realized over time I was sort of developing a system for myself and for others. And a couple of the pastors I helped spoke to a publisher and said, hey, this guy's saying stuff that we think a lot of our friends need to hear, a lot of pastors need to hear. So Crossway approached me and said, hey, would you put into writing what you've learned yourself, what you're teaching others, so that more can be helped by this? And we did. Started writing that. And my agent, who's a woman, started reading, and she said, David, women need to hear this too. So I chatted with my wife, who had a really bad depression 20 years before. Then it was 15 years before, and realized that a lot of what I was learning was what she had learned to recover from depression. Because while in her, overwork and stresses had resulted in more of a mental breakdown, when me it was physical, but many of the remedies were similar. So she wrote Refresh, I wrote Reset. Mine is for men, not just pastors. Hers is for women. And for women, there's a slight difference in the way they experience these things. And
I wrote them both.
Yeah, okay. So you can see there's overlap.
Yeah.
But there's also difference.
Yeah.
So that's the story behind the books. Personal experience that God used to lead us into a system that, with some flexibility, suits most people in recovery.
How do you define pastoral burnout? And what are the common signs and symptoms of the problem?
So initially, I really viewed burnout as a physical exhaustion issue or a mental exhaustion issue. I've learned since that it's more complex than that. It's made up generally of 3 parts. There's definitely physical exhaustion in it, exhaustion in general, but often burnout also has a component of cynicism. So, for example, you might become very cynical as a pastor about your members, the people you're trying to serve. You might start being critical towards them. Hey, they don't appreciate me. And or maybe your fellow office bearers, your elders, your co-pastors, you're disappointed in them and you feel they're not working hard enough. And so this general cynicism spreads, a questioning of others' motives, a critical spirit. And then the third part of it is often a sense of incompetence. I don't have the skills, the abilities for this position. Maybe something like that happened to you, Iago. You go from associate pastor to senior pastor, but you don't have the equipping for it automatically. And so you feel you're drowning, you feel you're stumbling, you're not living up to your own expectations or others. So that's the sort of fatal combination: exhaustion, cynicism, ineffectiveness that result in burnout with all its symptoms.
Some pastors are watching us right now, but the mainly public of the channel is normal people from church.
Yep.
So how can a church member spot these signs in their pastor in order to try to help him?
Yeah, I think it's more likely to be spotted by a co-pastor or an elder. If there's a good relationship between the pastors and the elders, this should be a recurring theme that they come back to, at least every year. And Pastor John, who you know, and I, our elders will often ask us, how is your workload? And they keep an eye as well. They watch us, because probably the previous pastor here did burn out. He was a very blessed pastor. He saw a lot of growth in his church and probably didn't have the help that he needed. He didn't have, as I do, a great assistant pastor. Hi, John.
He's smiling right there.
So I think it's harder for an ordinary church member to see it because they're not usually so close as elders and other pastors. But I think, members, if they have their own spiritual welfare at heart, they will encourage the other pastors, the other elders, to care for one another. Maybe a church member might spot it in, they begin to sense the sermons are just routine, robotic. There's a lack of passion. There's a lack of compassion. Maybe the sermons become more judgmental, critical, cold, legalistic, not so gospel-y, not so compassionate. I can think a sensitive person can spot when somebody is carrying a burden. So maybe just to approach the pastor and ask them, how are you doing? Take them out to lunch every year, take them out to breakfast or whatever, and just ask, how are you doing? And of course, a pastor has to trust you. They're not going to open up to everybody. And again, that's where I think elders and pastors, that's where the primary care should come from, but members should really want that amongst their leaders, amongst their elders, that culture of openness and vulnerability.
And in practice, how can I help my pastor to be mentally healthy?
Okay.
Don't sin a lot. It's a way to help him.
I think expectation is a huge part of burnout, okay? The pastor senses a level of expectation. Often he has a very high expectation of himself already. Good pastors do. But then on top of that comes a level of expectation in a congregation. And I think especially with our accessibility today, social media, texting, we are so much more available. Everyone has a direct line to the pastor in a way they didn't have before. And everyone thinks they are the only person contacting the pastor. When this might be the 20th or the 30th question or ask for help that they've had that day. So I think trying to help a congregation manage their expectation level of a pastor, and always, before you send that text, before you make that call, ask, is there someone else that can help me with this? Because we don't believe all wisdom begins and ends with the pastor. We have elders, we have mature Christians around us. Is there somebody in a closer circle to me that can help? I think that would be a big step towards relieving a pastor's workload, just a reduced expectation of instantaneous communication. And that's especially true where a church is growing, because what a pastor could do in one setting in a smaller church, as that church begins to grow, especially if it's unconverted people coming into the church, that is just like multiplying. I think another way is to ensure the pastor gets a full day off a week and takes his full vacation every year. And this is not about pastors wanting to have an easy life. The purpose of rest and recreation is to make them work better and work more efficiently and effectively. If you just run pastors into the ground without a day off, without a vacation, then ultimately what will happen is they'll have to take time off. They will be burned out. They will end up on sabbaticals trying to recover their health, or they'll just trundle through life at a low grade depression, exhaustion, with no sense of prioritizing and expending their efforts in areas of urgency rather than importance. So I think that also can help. Don't resent, but really enable pastors to take that God-commanded rest day a week and festival seasons, as they did in the Old Testament, to get times of recovery and rest. Try and really encourage their marriages, time with their own children, as well as time with the congregational children. And don't ever say to pastors, even jokingly, comments like sometimes I get, maybe Pastor John gets, I'm not sure, but, oh, you fishing again? Or not another vacation.
Yeah.
Because trust me, pastors already have a high level of guilt about that. And when they are working hard...
You are describing me in all this interview.
You're working so hard. You're working hours that people don't see in the early mornings and the late nights. And when that comes, it's like a dagger to the heart of a sensitive pastor. And they do respond by trying not to take that time that they need, which will only result in less of a man to serve you going forward.
In your book, you talk a lot about relationships. Pastors need to have friends as well. But we have this thinking in Brazil, really popular, that the people from your church can't be your friend. You need friends for elsewhere, but not in your church. But pastors are really busy if they church. So they doesn't have time to be with another pastor or a friend. How do you see that about friendship of the pastor and members of the church?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely been in contexts where the pastor is not expected to have friends in the congregation. And I followed that at times, and I think it was part of my own downfall. Since I have burned out twice, I've definitely made it a greater priority to have friendships, within the church and outside the church. And I think the mentality of you mustn't have friends within the church is born out of two fears: the fear of favoritism being seen and the fear of confidences being betrayed, right? And I think that can be maybe not avoided, but lessened in terms of risks by choosing the right people. Now, the people who want to be your friend in the congregation are maybe not the best people, okay?
Yeah.
So it's often the quieter people, the people that don't want to intrude into a pastor's life, they are maybe the better friends to have because they won't blab about it. You know, some people want to be known as friends of the pastor, but your truest friends won't do that. And these are the people, the quieter, more background people, are probably people that are more likely to keep confidences, more trustworthy. So there are people in every congregation you can more safely make friends with. So I think the key is to be really careful in your selection of friends. I have these friends in this congregation in a way that I have not had in any previous congregation. Two elders, actually. One is not an elder now, but these men have been wonderful friends to me and would never betray a confidence and would never sort of try and put themselves up over others because they are friends with the pastor. But I also have really made a point of developing friendships outside the congregation, and they're different. So, I would say with Pastor John coming, I have now a friend in pastoral ministry that I've never had before. Somebody that I just feel such a kinship with, and I don't feel like I am the senior pastor and he is the associate pastor. I feel we are very much co-pastoring this congregation together. And that's a rare thing. It's a very precious thing. And pray the Lord will give us it for many more years.
Yeah.
I have an older friend who, I'm 57. This friend's probably 67. He's not a pastor. He's not an elder. He's from another church. He's been a businessman, and I really make a point at least every month of getting together with him. And then I have friends who are not Christians who I go fishing with, and that is very precious to me that they would have me as their friend and I can have them as their friend. They're, you would say, blue collar people. Again, I think it's very important for pastors to have friendships outside of their, you might say, socio-economic class, if I can put it like that. I hate talking like that, but that's the reality. We tend to gravitate to people of similar academic training, similar economic status. I think it's really important for us to have friendships amongst people who are not like that. And I found some of these friendships the most enriching, challenging for sure, but really satisfying. So I think it can be done, but it has to be done carefully and wisely.
When a pastor seeks a psychology, does that mean his faith is weak?
It may do, it may not. I believe that God has given different gifts to different people. To pastors, he's given spiritual gifts. To others, he's given gifts of physical insight, doctors, physiotherapists, trainers, nutritionists. To others, he's given insights into psychology, the way patterns of thinking develop, the way our own development affects our thinking, the way our physical health affects our thinking and feeling. And therefore, when I talk with someone a pastor or anyone who has had a depression, anxiety, a breakdown of some kind, I'm always trying to think, what is the package of care that they need? It may be all a pastor needs is some good, strong, convictional biblical counseling, right? Depending on their situation, if they've fallen into pornography, for example. But it may be that a pastor needs some physical help, whether that's somebody to help them look after their body better. It may be they need some cognitive training. Patterns of thinking have developed that maybe stem from childhood and the way their parents talk to them, may stem from abuse in their childhood or their teen years. It may be bad experiences they've had as an adult, even in the ministry, traumatic experiences that have developed patterns of thinking that are extremely damaging. They're often very negative, obsessive, cyclical. And really, pastors, biblical counselors are not as equipped to help someone with that as someone that is their everyday job. Ideally, someone who's a Christian psychologist, Christian psychiatrist, but not always necessary. A lot of good can be done from people who have really good training and just helping us identify unhelpful thought patterns and then helping us reverse them. And then we put that in a biblical framework. We fill it with biblical truth as well, but things like cognitive behavioral therapy in a Christian framework with Christian content is extremely helpful. I have found it helpful. My wife has found it helpful. I've recommended it to many people. And I think so we want to put together, recognizing we are whole people, that we are complex people, complicated people, that we need spiritual, emotional, physical, mental, relational, vocational help in different proportions, depending upon the nature of our problems and challenges. So sometimes it's an act of faith to go to a psychologist, in that we are following God's command to look after ourselves, to steward our minds, and to get the help we need to glorify Him in our bodies as well as in our souls.
This holistic way to see the human being was, for me, one of the best things in our book, you know, because when we are in struggle in our mental health or in our emotions, we are pastors. We are in the other side of the table, you know? See ourselves as people. I can get help from a psychologist, from a medical, from something, not only a friend or a biblical consulship, but maybe use a professional who can help me. It humbles you, you know?
It does, yeah.
I need to be on the other side of the table.
Well, I think you put your finger there on a very important insight. Sometimes it's actually pride that keeps us away from seeking help. And, you know, we have this idea that anything outside of the Bible is not true and not helpful, which is a denial of God's grace, common grace, often called providential grace, in giving gifts to different people in different professions. And I've seen people that it's actually the sin of pride that keeps them from getting the help they need, rather than superior faith. And they may, you know, keep their strong sense of spiritual superiority. I never take meds. I never, you know, seek help from doctors. I never get psychology input. But their whole family and maybe even their congregation is disintegrating all around them. Yeah. It can be a terrible act of selfishness, actually, not an act of faith. So having said that, we know that resorting only to psychologists, only to medication, or running to these first of all, can be unbelief, right? And therefore it's a very delicate area to navigate. And that's why I think getting people who know us best, our wives, our elders, friends, to help us in this and just be really vulnerable and transparent with them, recognizing we may take missteps along the way, but trusting God to oversee the whole process and guide us into the right package of care for us in this situation.
Pastor Murray, what a great talk. Thank you for this time. I have a last question, but it's a closing question, you know?
Yep.
What final advice would you give to pastors and religious leaders who are struggling with burnout or wishing to prevent it?
So I think the first, if not the hardest step to take, is actually to talk about it.
Yeah.
I think from my own experience and trying to help others, if you can get to that, talking to someone else, your co-pastor, your wife, your doctor, your pastor, think you're 50% of the way there, right? That is the hardest thing for a man, especially a Christian man, and especially a pastor to do, to admit I am weak and I need help. And when you get to that point and you do manage to tell your story, I think you're 50% of the way there. And there's a tremendous relief in it. There's even actually a lot of healing just in doing that. God has made us to be healed by words, and it begins with us confessing words of weakness and fallenness and frailty, and yes, faults and sins too, that bad decisions that have led to this situation. We're not faultless. We're never faultless in these situations. And I think once you do that, you open yourself up to God and to His people to speak words into your life. And I think I would encourage pastors to do this because their usefulness will multiply way beyond their expectation. I think every pastor feels, if I do this, like, people are going to doubt me, they're going to question me. If he's a mess, how can I listen to him? What I've seen myself, what I've seen in multiple times with pastors, that it's quite the reverse. Rather than limiting usefulness, ending usefulness, the field of usefulness just balloons, because everyone in the pew is just like you, and you drop your defenses, they think, I can drop mine. I'd only issue one word of warning: be prepared for a lot of counselling requests to come, because it happened to me, it's happened to many pastors I've spoken to. Until people sense that you are a weak man, that you need help, they will not come to you with their weaknesses seeking help. Therefore, you need to be prepared for more work. And you need to build systems around you of counselling, people you can refer to in the community, because otherwise you'll end up in another burnout. I wish I could say that my words and my work have helped prevent burnouts. I don't think they have done that often, because every man thinks it won't happen to them. But what my work, I hope, will do is help those who have had the burnout recover so that they don't have it again, and so that they can begin to live lives of joy, and joy in ministry. It's not just a boring drudge and monotonous exhaustion, but recover their joy, personal joy, vocational joy, family joy, joy in God's people, joy in God, and so fuel ministry going forward that will be satisfying and rewarding and a great blessing to everybody.
Thank you very much. Esse foi o papo que a gente teve agora com o pastor David Murray. Que conversa boa, pra mim, nossa, dá vontade de ficar aqui mais um ano só conversando com o homem. Mas se você quiser continuar conversando com ele, vai estar aqui na descrição os links para você comprar o Reset e o Refresh, ambos publicados pela maravilhosa editora Fiel, aí em português, um excelente trabalho editorial, uma ótima tradução, que abençoou muito a minha vida, também pode abençoar muito a sua vida. A gente tem vídeo sempre 10 horas da manhã, às terças e quinta-feiras, mas às vezes tem outros vídeos aqui no canal, então se inscreva para não perder nenhum vídeo novo. Um cheiro no seu cangote e até a próxima.